is it important to communicate with the younger generation through this language of graphic novels? I mean, why did you choose to tell your story this way?
Well, this young man encouraged me, but let me just simply believe in dramatizing things. This book here, Martin Luther King, the Montgomery story, sold for 10 cents, 14 pages. I've heard of Rosa Parks and Dr. King back in 1955 when I was 15 years old in the 10th grade. Later, in 1958, I had an opportunity to read. We were studying the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. And if it hadn't been for this story and the words of Dr. King and what was happening in Little Rock, I probably wouldn't be standing here. So it all came together. And someplace along the way, Andrew, you can tell it as often as you want to.
So we actually brought these back into print because of March. It's an interesting story how these came about and how it played into our story, because you know, I was 24 when the congressman first told me about it, and I was on his campaign, and I was captivated by this idea of a comic book playing a role in the civil rights movement. Comics have been maligned in so many ways for so long. I've been a lifelong comics fan. I've been a fan since I was a little kid. And for us to have this example that had gone unnoticed, right? John Lewis tells me about it, but nobody talked about it really to that point, especially the national press. So I started asking him, you know, why don't you write a comic? And eventually he said yes, but only if I would write it with him. For me, I actually went on to write my graduate thesis on this comic book. I went to Georgetown for public policy, and I'm pretty sure that's the first grad thesis they've ever had on a comic book at Georgetown. But they went along with it and they entertained me, and I found that Dr. King actually helped edit it. And to me, that was one of those meaningful moments that is that needs to be brought to the forefront, right? You don't ever imagine Dr. King in 1957 sitting at his desk going over a comic book script. But right around the birth of his first, the time of the birth of his first child, he did just that, and in fact, they incorporated his edits into the final version. But for us, and for what it represents to March, it was a proof of concept. Here you had a comic book that had actually inspired some of the earliest acts of civil disobedience. It was used by Jim Lawson, Congressman Lewis's mentor, all throughout the South. It was used in the Midwest even, in some sit-ins that had been that didn't receive the media attention that the Greensboro 4 did, but also highlighted the role that freshmen played. Right? Greensboro 4 were freshmen, and so as we do these first-year reading programs, and we look at the past and how Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story was used to inspire nonviolence, it's all the more important that we go and we speak to the kids, and that they do read about nonviolence, and that the precedent of graphic novels and comics being used to inspire those kids opens this door to us, and we shouldn't ignore it because some congressman in the 50s told us the comics were bad, and so that's what we're trying to do, and that's why we're coming here.
To speak to that question coming from a different angle, yeah, I feel like the perception and the role of comics in the United States is sort of still in a final stage of recovery from 1953, 1954, from the Frederick Wortham Senate hearing era. For my generation, I was born in the late 70s, and I had become an avid reader by the time I was 6 or 7 years old, but I'd also been reading comics as my entry point to reading by age 3. I don't know, I ignored a lot of the general dismissal of comics. Now it's at least acceptable as a point of conversation, that when people are reading comics, at least they're reading something, which, whatever. But the core of that is certainly true, and comics do serve as a gateway to the habit, to the discipline of reading, to the absorption of information. But to speak about what's in comics, all comics, especially how, I don't know, I've been making comics for 25 years. I've been publishing them for 23 years. And obviously the first half decade of that was just me as an adolescent making superhero comics. But not only is my approach and my general relationship to my creation fundamentally the same, but really it was Chris Claremont's run on the X-Men in the 70s and the 80s that awakened my social conscience in the most fundamental way when I was 11, 12, 13 years old. You know, being able to use epic stories of struggle and conflict to illuminate to so many readers over the decades, you know, fundamental tales that relate to racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, nationalism in a way that allows people of all ages to absorb and process, but for people who are somewhere between, you know, 8 and 15 years old, this can come as a revelation. And so, I don't know, I like being able to see my personal path through comics as being a continuum and not one that has to sort of throw out the formative years as being something that doesn't apply now that I've moved on to subject matter and to a context for comics, to a destination for comics, which is entirely different than a dusty comic book store. To me, it's all the same, and it all serves the function of broadening a worldview and allowing people of all ages to process thought and engage in dialogue.